Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Fuji X-mount version of the Viltrox Pro AF 56mm F1.2. Now, I did release my review of the Sony E-mount version about a month ago. However, in this case, there's been so many other new releases that have come in between, but I did have a copy of both mounts of the lens at the same time, and so it gave me a unique opportunity to compare and contrast them, number one, but then also on Fuji, I have already owned the Fuji XF 56mm F1.2 WR, which is really the most logical competition for this lens on any platform. So it's enabled me to do a fair bit of head-to-head, and I will release a subsequent video where I just look at those two lenses directly head-to-head, but also a chance to evaluate how well this Viltrox lens survives the transition to Fuji X-mount. And so over the course of this review, we're going to be looking at the areas in which it does differentiate a bit from the E-mount version when it comes to the build, to the autofocus, and even to the optical performance, considering here I have an opportunity to test on Fuji's extremely high demand 40 megapixel sensor. And so today's review, we're going to dive into all of those different aspects. I'm going to film and am filming all of the outdoor segments on the lens, and so you have a chance to see how it renders and also an extended look on how well it handles at least this kind of autofocus, but we'll detail that a little bit more in that particular section. And so without further ado, we're going to dive into it. And I will say before we do that, in full disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Viltrox for evaluation. However, as always, they have had no input in my findings, nor have they seen this video before you do. Let's jump in. All right, so let's dive into the build and handling. So just so you know, I'm filming this segment, the indoor segments, on the Sony E-mount version of the lens. And so this whole video will be shot on the 56mm F1.2, either on the Fuji version or the Sony version. This lens is currently available in Sony E-mount and Fuji X-mount, both of which I've now covered. There is an upcoming Z-mount version in the future, and so that's good news for those who are Nikon APS-C shooters. So this is a lens designed for APS-C, and in my Sony E-mount version test, I did discover that it definitely does not cover the full frame image circle. This is an APS-C lens. 56mm is very popular for APS-C because that translates with the 1.5 times crop factor into essentially an 85mm lens. It's about 84mm if you do the math. And so obviously that's right in the sweet spot for portraiture and a very popular focal length in general. The price at $580 is really competitive here on the Fuji platform, where Fuji lenses tend to be a little bit more expensive because they are, they're a little bit more premium lenses, whereas some other manufacturers are making kind of their top lenses are more full frame lenses. When it comes to Fuji, they haven't done full frame, and so they're making more premium lenses in the APS-C space. So their lenses do tend to be pricier, and of course the one that we're comparing to here is about $1,200 US. And so at $580 less with the coupon discount code that you can find in the description down below, you can get that obviously cheaper still. The Sigma, for example, there's a Sigma 56mm F1.4 that's available on X-mount, but it's going to cost you, about the same price as the Viltrox lens. And so if size is not a priority, you can get this Viltrox lens with definitely some superior performance areas for cheaper, or at least the same price as the Sigma lens. Now, as far as the feature set here, first of all, in Fuji speak, there are basically three kind of areas that designate more premium lenses on Fuji. And so one of those is R, which is the most common. That means that it just has an aperture ring, which we do here. Then the second is WR, which means that it has weather resistance or weather sealing. We have a thorough weather sealing here. I haven't seen a diagram, but previous lenses in the series are anywhere between 10 and 12 different seal points. There's a nice thick gasket at the lens mount, coating on the front element, seals throughout at the switch points, at the rings, and so it is a professionally grade weather sealing that is there. And then on top of that, on Fuji, it's LM, which stands for linear motor, meaning it's got a more premium focus system. And while this isn't a linear motor per se, the Hyper VCM focus motor means that you're getting a premium autofocus system in this. And so it basically checks all the boxes of what a high-end premium lens on X-mount would have. This is very slightly the smallest lens in the series. It is almost identical in dimensions to the 27mm f1.2, a lens that I really love. But it is just a hair narrower than that lens, and thus it is just a hair lighter as well. And so it's not by any kind of meaningful margin. Really, the outlier here is the 75mm f1.2, which is a fair bit bigger and heavier than either the 27 or the 56mm lenses. So that shakes out at being 78.4 millimeters in diameter, or 3.08 inches, and 92 millimeters in length, or 3.61 inches. Now that does make it about 16 millimeters longer than what the Fuji WR lens is, though the Fuji is just a bit wider in diameter. It's only about a millimeter, so nothing significant there. The weight comes in at 570 grams, which is right over 20 ounces. And so that does make it significantly heavier than the Sigma, for example, which is 280 grams, though the Sigma is only f1.4. The Fuji is 445 grams, and then the Sirui Sniper, which is an f1.2 lens as well, it weighs in at 419 grams. And so this is definitely the heaviest by a fair margin there in the case when you're looking versus the Fuji lens. We're talking, roughly 130 grams difference there. It has 67mm front filter threads, same as the 27mm, also the same as the WR lens from Fuji. It does have the USB-C port in the dock, and so you can do firmware updates, and certainly Viltrox is very thorough at doing those and making sure that the lens stays supported along the way. Inside the aperture iris, we have 11 blades, again, same as the Fuji, and as mentioned already, we do have an aperture ring. This is a clicked ring. It does have light clicks at all the 1/3 stop detents, and then a harder, a little bit more resistance and a longer throw between f16 and automatic mode. Now, what we don't have is an iris lock here, which is true of the Sony version as well. However, what we're lacking relative to the Sony version is that we have no AF/MF switch, we have no custom or function button, and we have no ability to declick the aperture. And the reason for that is that these are features that are just not supported here on Fuji. Actually, the first 75mm f1.2, it did have an AF/MF switch, and you could tell that, Viltrox was trying that because it came to Fuji first. However, I also found that it did cause a little bit of quirks at times because, the way that Fuji mostly works is that it's relying on a button or a lever attached to the camera body as opposed to the lens. And so they have a different standard than the other brands. And I think that Viltrox has basically had to come back and conform to that standard, which unfortunately, it just feels like you're getting a lens with less features because, well, that's exactly what's happening. The problem here is not really Viltrox. The problem is that it's really time for Fuji to update their standard, particularly considering that they have so many camera bodies that are very, very capable for video. So why not allow for some video-specific features in the lenses? Like being able to declick the aperture, for example. Right now, as it stands, Fuji apertures are really not useful for doing aperture racks or things like that because everything is in these, little set aperture steps along the way. And so that's something I would love to see changed. Now, one thing that is good here, the manual focus ring is beautiful. Everything is metal here. The whole body is metal construction. It is very high-end construction. And there's a beautiful manual focus ring here. And as compared to the premium lens from Fuji, I vastly prefer what happens here on the Viltrox. For one thing, this is a much better autofocus motor, but as it translates to manual focus, it means that you actually have this smooth linear focus, which feels like true manual focus, as opposed to on the Fuji lens, it still feels like little steps. And particularly if you're trying to be precise, you can feel focus move in chunks as opposed to a nice linear process. And so I definitely prefer what I'm getting from the Viltrox lens when it comes to that. Minimum focus distance here is 50 centimeters, same as Fuji, and magnification of 0.13 times is not exceptionally high, but it is enough to be useful. And of course, having that f1.2 aperture means that depth of field is tiny. As you can see here, shooting Viltrox's new flash, it's about to come out. You can see that the depth of field is tiny there, and so you can see that the 16,000 megahertz is actually, you can see that, but anything even in that like a millimeter deeper than that is out of focus already. And so a depth of field is tiny at that point, but it has nice good contrast and resolution at that point and is very useful. We'll note one other thing before we move on. The lens hood here is improved over some of the earlier iterations in the series. Some of the early ones did not click in definitely, whereas this one definitely does. And one other thing that's interesting is that while this lens is longer, as we've already determined, the lens hood from the Fuji lens is kind of massive. And so what you actually end up is when you have the lens hoods mounted, the two lenses, I mean, the Viltrox is still maybe a couple of millimeters longer, but it basically eradicates that difference in overall length because the Fuji hood is so large. And the other thing I will say about that is the Fuji hood is also a much wider in diameter, and so you can see that while the Viltrox hood doesn't quite fit inside, it actually fits somewhat inside here, and so this actually takes up a little bit more room in your bag than what the Viltrox hood does, because the Viltrox hood does fit a little bit more tightly like that, and so just something to be aware of. One other thing I will point out before I move on from this is that this does employ floating elements to allow for better up-close performance. So if the lens is detached or the camera is off, even if it's attached to the camera, you will feel something moving around inside. You're going to find that to be increasingly more common in the future because this is a means by which engineers can eliminate other flaws in the optical design and get higher performance. But what happens is that once the lens is energized, the camera is turned on, that clunk will go away. And that's just because those elements are now energized and they're responding. And so they're not, kind of floating anymore at that point. So just something to be aware of. There's nothing wrong with your lens. If you feel something moving around in there, turn on the camera. And if it goes away, that means that it's perfectly normal in operation. All told, this is although it's a stripped down version relative to the Sony, and I don't like that, this is a beautifully made lens. It's a very good looking lens, great looking finish on it. I really like it. Now we know from the Sony review already, those of you that have watched that this is the first of the Pro Series lenses from Viltrox to get their higher end Hyper VCM focus motor. So that is a voice coil motor, which means it's a much more sophisticated motor compared to their older STM motors that has, more complexity, more thrust. It's quieter. It's just a higher end autofocus motor generally. And at least on the Sony version, it was able to do some pretty awesome things. Unfortunately, as is always the case, as I transition over to Fuji, the hardware of the lens is held back somewhat by the hardware of the camera, and then also I suspect somewhat by the focus algorithms involved here. Fuji's autofocus is just not as sophisticated, and it does show up. Whereas relative to other Fuji lenses, I actually felt like I had good autofocus for stills. I did have a few more misses than what I did with the Sony version of the lens. And what's more, I also found that, focus is just not as fun, if I could use that word. I did use it in a wedding setting, and what I found there is that actually I was able to get the shots that I wanted. Sometimes I felt like I was struggling a little bit more to land them than what I would have with an equivalent Sony camera. However, I was able to get shots even in more high pressure situation where there wasn't a lot of reaction times, say couples coming in from a bright outside into a dimmer interior. It's kind of a difficult transition, and I was able to get decent shots in that setting even though they're moving or dancing or doing something as they came in. Likewise, the ability to nail very narrow depth of field shots at f1.2, but also to get good accurate autofocus was very useful for a lot of different settings and produced images that I really liked as a byproduct. I also did a bit of a mini portrait session with my son, and then also I was using there's a new Viltrox Spark flash that's just coming out, and I wanted to test that at the same time. And I found that in that setting I did get typically well-focused results, but there was maybe 2 or 3 shots that weren't perfectly focused. And frankly, on Sony these days, I'm always shocked if I have any missed portrait shots, no matter the lens, because, it's always really, really good. And that was the case with the E-mount version of this lens. And so in general, I think focus for stills was good. And I would say that relative to other lenses on the platform, very good. And Certainly, if you look at the quality of focus, comparing this lens to the Buzzy micro motor that's on the 56mm F1.2 WR, this Viltrox lens is way better in performance. It's a nicer lens to use, and I did feel more confident using it, even though at the end of the day, I'm not sure that my keeper rate would be radically different. It's the quality of focus that is definitely superior. So how about video AF? I continue to be very frustrated with the Fuji platform generally when it comes to autofocus, but in particular for video autofocus. For having cameras that are so good at recording video, as you can see right now, they really are not backed up by very effective autofocus systems when it comes to the hardware underlying in the camera itself. The Viltrox is definitely not going to dissuade me from that opinion. You can see here in my focus pulls test that when I try to do touch to focus, and I hate doing touch to focus on Fuji generally, because you get a wide variety of responses. Sometimes it'll actually do what you want it to do. Sometimes it seems to do nothing for several seconds. There's a big lag, and then focus will begin to happen. And then sometimes I sit there waiting, say, well, it's gonna happen, and it never does. And I have to touch again and again, maybe trying to find a little different spot to tweak it to try to get it to do what I want. But even when it did do those focus pulls, you can see that they're blocky, there are lots of visible steps, a lack of confidence. There's nothing about it that I like. So I wondered, is the Fuji lens going to be any better? Which I could hardly imagine that it could be, because its built-in autofocus in the lens, the focus motor, is so terrible. But it was a little bit better. It's not great. There's still some obvious stepping, particularly at the end as it settles in. But it is a smoother transition, even though it made a lot more noise in the process. I saw something similar when I did my hand test, that the transition from my hand to my eye, it was a little bit better on Fuji than it was on the Viltrox, because sometimes the Viltrox didn't really make the transition. But what I did notice is a lot of the time the Fuji focus was on my ear and not really on my eye. So even then, with this $1,200 Fuji lens, it really wasn't all that great. When I tried to approach the camera, as I've been doing in this shot a little bit, but I then stepped out of frame, the Viltrox, it focused to the background, but then it never picked me back up when I stepped back in frame. The Fuji lens did, but it also kind of cheated. It predicted that I had stepped out of frame and I was going to step back in, and so it never shifted focus. So when I stepped back in, I was still in focus. That did tell me something though, and that is that clearly Viltrox is not getting access to the same focus algorithms that Fuji's own lens did. And so in this case, even though the Fuji lens has the inferior autofocus motor, which is really obvious in operation, it is able in some situations to get a little bit better focus results because of those focus algorithms. I likewise found when I was shooting with the Viltrox lens that, ordinary transitions from one subject to another where I wasn't trying to touch to focus, they went okay, but there's obvious stepping. It's not smooth, it's not cinematic. I also saw in this clip when I had locked onto a subject and I tried to approach it with the camera that you can see focus slips and goes in and out. It's just not what any of us would want for our content creation. And so at this point, with the state of the focus algorithms and the state of the hardware on the Fuji platform, I think you're probably going to be better off if you're serious about video and using first-party Fuji lenses, even if they aren't really all that much better either. Okay, let's talk image quality here. Same as the Sony version, we've got the same optical design, 13 elements in 8 groups. There are 3 high refractive index elements, 1 extra low dispersion, and then 1 ultra large aspherical element. And that element is a new one for Viltrox that I've not seen previously. The MTF looks really, really great. You'll see that there's low astigmatism in both the sagittal and meridional lines. They stay close together, and at f8, it's basically a straight line across the top. You know that this is a very high-performing lens. In the other metrics as we break it down, and I will have a more thorough deep dive into the optics at the end of the video, so I'm just going to jump through it more quickly here. The big difference here on Fuji, obviously, is you're moving to a much higher standard when it comes to the sensor demand if you're shooting with the 40 megapixel sensor, as I am here. And so 40 megapixels on a 1.5 times APS-C crop is the equivalent of over 90 megapixels on a full frame sensor in terms of pixel density. That's a really demanding platform, and so we'll see if this this lens can survive that transition. I looked at it at 26 megapixels on Sony. That's a much lower standard relative to 40. And so we'll see how that plays out here. But in terms of some of the other optical issues that are there, as when I tested for vignette and distortion, there is the tiniest amount of distortion. It's pretty close to neutral, but there's about a -1 of pincushion distortion to correct. By the way, that's same as the Fuji lens. In terms of the vignette was a little bit heavier on Fuji than I saw on Sony, but it's not a huge difference. I used a +62 to correct here. In the same test, I needed to use a +52 to correct for the Fuji, so the Fuji has ever so slightly less vignette than the Viltrox lens, but it's very, very close. I found that when I tested for a longitudinal style chromatic aberration, there is a little bit of fringing before and after the plane of focus, but it's minimal. When I looked here at a three-dimensional subject, my dad's old SLR, I found that there, again, is a tiny bit of fringing, but not enough to be obvious unless you're looking at 100% magnification level. And so no big problem there. There's a bit of lateral style chromatic aberration in the corner, but again, it's very, very tiny, and you only see it at very high levels of magnification. Not really a real world issue. I found that when I began to test for resolution and contrast, so here we're looking at that 40 megapixels and crops are going to be shown at 200% magnification, you can see that the crops look consistently good across the frame. This is a lens that's very sharp in the center, very sharp in the mid frame, and only slightly less sharp in the corners. And just for a quick comparison to the Fuji lens, you can see that basically at every point across the frame, there is just a little bit more sharpness and contrast for the Viltrox as opposed to the more expensive Fuji lens at f1.2. And if we really want to see how great this is compared to a more closely priced alternative, the Sure Sniper 56mm F1.2, you can see here in comparing to it that it's night and day at f1.2 in the center and in the corners. The Viltrox lens just blows it out of the water. You will see mild improvements as you stop down. As soon as f1.4, a little bit more contrast. By f2, really looking good. And by f2.8, the corners are basically razor sharp, and that's going to stay that way through f8. Landscape images look amazing, lots of detail, lots of contrast, and of course, lots of pixels on all of that if you're shooting on this high resolution sensor. By the time you get to f11, you'll start to see some diffraction and a little bit more pronounced at f16, which is the minimum aperture. But even on this really pixel-dense platform, I didn't find that diffraction was necessarily terrible either. And so, you might be able to get away with shooting at f16 in some situations. The bokeh quality from this lens is really, really nice. Now, when I say really nice, that doesn't mean perfect geometry at f1.2 with no cat eye type look. You'll see as you stop down here that that does get nice and circular as you get towards f2 in particular. But it's more that just the overall background is very soft. The bokeh is very soft. I will release that head-to-head with this lens, but frankly, it's very hard for me to determine backgrounds between the two lenses, and that's amazing because this is a beautiful performer in that metric. You see in this video of use the sprinkler and some evening directional light, you can see just that really nice specular highlights from that. And this shot here I love. It just shows off the best qualities of this lens. It's really, really crisp in detail at f1.2 and where it matters, and then the background is just beautifully soft, and it has that ability to just kind of swirl together colors in a really pleasing fashion. And so all of that I think is really, really nice. One of the great things about a lens like this, f1.2 lenses on APS-C, is it does allow you to reclaim some of that full frame look to where you can get a very shallow depth of field and thus a unique dimensionality of your subject versus the background. And I did find the colors were great. I did shoot a lot of people photos with this. And of course, I do love Fuji's sensors. I critique things about Fuji, particularly when it comes to autofocus, but I do love their sensors and their color science. And so this was a nice match for that. I did note that there are some minor flaring and flashing issues at wide apertures. You're going to see that, in a little like, kind of almost like light leak type looks, or, just little blotches in certain compositions. To me, it's artistic there. However, your mileage may vary. As you stop it down, it becomes a more traditional pattern where you're going to see a little bit more ghosting. And the biggest thing to me is actually not the ghosting. I find that if the sun or the light source is right in the frame, the streaks coming off of that, the sun rays, if you want to call them that, they're just a little dominating to my taste. And so this is not a perfect flare resistance, but again, you know, f1.2 lenses, it's tough to get perfect. And so I think that they've done a fairly good job. I think it's very easy to avoid anything negative just through composition and choosing your aperture wisely. So at the end of the day, I mean, you're not going to find a better optical performance, particularly at this price point, and maybe at any price point at this focal length right now on the Fuji platform. It's fantastic. So in conclusion, in the previous two Pro Series releases for APS-C, they've actually released the Fuji X-mount versions first, and then several months later, they released the Sony E-mount versions. And so in those previous cases, I've had a chance to evaluate the lens first on Fuji and to kind of accept it, warts and all, that comes as a part of the Fuji package. And then a few months later, when I have a chance to test the E-mount version, it's like I get new features, I get better performance. It's great. It's not so great when you go the other direction. And so I did the review of the Sony version first, where I had more features, I had better autofocus performance, and of course the one thing that does differentiate is that this Fuji sensor is a really interesting lens. It's challenging, but this is a lens that's up to that. But in many ways it feels like I'm getting less of what I got on Sony, and that is the unfortunate reality for many Fuji shooters in general right now. Fuji shooters are very loyal to their system for a good reason. There's a lot of things that Fujifilm does really well, and there's a lot of things that I like about their cameras, but they desperately need an autofocus improvement, an upgrade at this point to become competitive with the other packages. And I also want to see them to embrace some more video specific features. It's clear that these lens manufacturers have the ability to produce those features because they're doing it on other platforms, but it is Fuji's own kind of standard that is holding them back at this point, and I really want to see that improve. So at the end of the day, this is a really intriguing lens still here on Fuji despite those warts. And when you look at it compared to the main competition in the XF 56mm F1.2 WR, it's hard to see the Viltrox as being anything but compelling, considering you can get it for less than half the price. So at the end of the day, I do think that there is a market for this lens on Fuji, and of course all of us are awaiting the day that maybe Fuji's next camera is going to unlock that superior autofocus that we have been looking for. And when that day comes, I hope that this lens shines on that platform. Now, if you want more information, you have a couple of options. I do have a full text review that is linked in the description down below that is unique to the Fuji X-mount version of the lens. And also, if you want that deeper dive into the optical performance, I'm going to jump into that right after this. So stay tuned. Okay, we'll start with a look at vignette and distortion. You can see that if you look at the image on the left, which is an uncorrected RAW, it is pretty close to distortion free, but there is just a tiny little amount of pincushion distortion. A -1 straightens that right up. Again, that's just like the WR lens from Fuji. There is some obvious vignette in the corners, a little bit more than what I saw on Sony. A +62 corrected that out and gave us basically a perfect manual correction, which is great to see. So just a little bit more vignette than the Fuji lens, but they're close. Taking a look at longitudinal style chromatic aberrations before and after the plane of focus, I see a bit more actually on the magenta end than I do on the green end after the plane of focus. It's not bad or strongly pronounced. If I take a look here really close at my dad's old SLR, you can see that a very good contrast in this zone here. A tiny bit of fringing on some of those shiny surfaces, but nothing extreme at all. No major problem there. I found in shots like this, glass can obviously be a big factor, but you can see it's really nice and clean. No fringing showing up in this particular image. And so overall, I'm pretty impressed with I don't think that any of those aberrations are going to have real world implications. Likewise, there is a little bit of lateral style chromatic aberrations you can see here in these transition zones. Not too bad, however, and also a little bit less than what the Fuji has. So, I mean, again, I look for them in real world images. I couldn't really find them. It's only at these really high level of magnification that they show up. Okay, so for a look at the test chart, this is going to be shown at 200% levels of magnification. Center of the frame, we've got great detail, great contrast. This is looking really awesome. Mid-frame looks exceptionally good, really strong and consistent. If I pan down this way, we see that there's a good consistency from here to here without a really obvious drop-off. All the way down to here, still looking very sharp, and really right off to the corner, you see all those fine details. The contrast isn't quite as high, but all those fine details are still being rendered, so that's impressive. So for a quick look of a comparison here, which I'll do a lot more of in the actual head-to-head video, you can see in the middle of the frame, there's a little bit more contrast and detail for the Viltrox lens versus the more expensive Fuji. Likewise, in the mid-frame, there's an edge there, and off into the corners, that edge remains there. And whereas the Fuji, I think, matches it in terms of contrast, definitely not as much detail there in the corners. We look over on this side, and we see that here, I would say the Fuji is closer, and up in this zone I would say the Fuji looks a little bit better. Up into the upper left corner, again, Fuji is looking better. So it's the Fuji. Unfortunately, I really tried. I shot this. You'll see this is chart test number 3. I shot this again and again, trying to make sure it wasn't kind of a balance issue for me. I do think that there's a bit of a centering issue very slightly on the Fuji lens. The Viltrox is a more consistent performance. The Fuji is a little bit more biased to the left side. But to give you some context on how all of this looks real world, f1.2, you can see that we've got lots of detail on these girls at f1.2. In this shot of my son at f1.2, you can see lots of skin textures, plenty to work with even at f1.2. Likewise here, wide open f1.2. I think any portrait photography would be fine with that to work with. For shooting like fine details here in a wedding setting, you can see that there's plenty of contrast to hold up even at close focus distances. All of that is good. The shot of Nala moving along, good detail, good contrast, and then of course a nice, really shallow depth of field look, which is hard to get on APS-C unless you're shooting with an f1.2 lens. Now, on some sharp lenses, you basically get as much as you're going to get wide open. In this case, there is more left in the tank. And so here, even at f1.4, you can see there's just a little bit more contrast and a little bit more fine detail there. From f1.4 to f2, contrast increases yet more. And you can see, looking here at the mid-frame, looking really, really fantastic. The corners are looking much brighter, as you can see, and thus allowing more contrast and detail to show up there. And here into this upper left corner, you can see it's also improving here as well. Quick pop back in with the Fuji lens, and so in the middle of the frame, Fuji's taken nice strides, and I would say at f2 here it is very similar. It's very close in contrast, maybe even a hair more. In the mid frame, the two lenses are pretty closely matched. I don't see a major difference there. And down into the corners, I would say that the Viltrox is still rendering details a little bit better, but the Fuji's contrast looks really good. And as before, we saw that it was stronger on this side. There's still a little bit of advantage, I think, particularly in contrast, but it's not strongly pronounced at all. But I think a little bit better on this left side. The Fuji looks pretty strong there relative to the Viltrox. So at f2.8, more contrast still, and then obviously by f5.6, we're definitely into the peak levels of performance. If we look here, we can see that the corners are looking really crisp, particularly as you get to f4 and f5.6. Great detail and contrast there. I mean, everywhere you look, it's just really, really great, really strong, good contrast, good delineation of all of those fine details. Very impressive. So out in the real world, even in a shot, obviously, that has a lot of depth to it, you can see right here into the corners, great details that are showing up there. And as we look into the distance, all throughout the image from side to side, it's really consistent. It's you're not seeing like a big drop off of contrast or detail somewhere. So an impressive performance overall for landscape work. Now by f11, you'll start to see a little bit of softening due to diffraction and a little bit more pronounced at f16. However, unlike some lenses, I don't find like it just turns to mush at the minimum aperture. It still looks pretty good. It's a little bit less contrast, but detail still looks good. And so I do think that at 100% magnification, it would still be very usable. Now, the up-close performance is strong even at f1.2. You can see good contrast and good detail that's being rendered there, and so it's holding up very nicely. Here's a three-dimensional object here. This is their new spark flash that is coming out. But you can see if we look here at a pixel level that while depth of field is really small, like this is obviously out of focus, where we have the 1600 megahertz, you can see it's really rendering that very, very fine detail quite nicely. As I mentioned, this image kind of depicts my favorite things about this lens. Great detail and contrast where it's supposed to have it, and then a very nice soft, defocused area in the background. You can see here a little bit closer look at what the geometry is like. There is a bit of a swirl effect at a certain distance. You may not like that. I do. I find that to be very, very cool for portrait work, and so something to consider. Obviously, the ability at f1.2 to really nicely isolate subjects, and so we can see the subject is really sharply delineated, but everything else is out of focus, and so it allowed me to use these ladies as a natural frame looking towards the cake there. Again, this is another image that shows off nice detail and contrast in the subject matter, and then a very nicely defocused background. Here, just kind of isolating a few flowers within this wedding tent here. You can see that the background moves towards defocus nicely. Look at the cake, and you can see again, it stands out, very sharply delineated with a soft background. All of that is good. Again, at flare resistance, we'll take one final look here. You can see there's almost a little bit of a light leak kind of look there. And a little bit of a ghosting down here, a little bit of veiling, loss of contrast, but overall not bad there. Stopping down here to more of a mid-range, and you can see a little bit of a blob for ghosting there. The other light leak has gone away, and there's a little bit more of a pattern here. Then by f11, the ghosting blobs are a little bit more obvious, and they're darker, and so that's a bigger problem. And then, as I mentioned, I don't love these really long shafts of light that are, to me, is kind of just dominating. It's probably going to be rare that you'd be shooting at f11 with this lens into the sun, but just in case you do, know that that is a possible side effect. Overall, this is a nice, strong optical performance. So thanks for sticking around until the very end, and I hope the deep dive into the optics has helped you to decide whether or not this is the lens for you. As always, thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.